Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. Welcome to chapter 9 of our Democracies at War lectures. We will have a look today at mainstream media. And the main claim of this chapter consists in saying that mainstream media in Western liberal democracies do contribute to undermine what we could call a genuine democratic political life. That is to say, they contribute to the supremacy of the executive power when it comes to decide to launch wars. And we will see this with, of course, the examples of our Western liberal democracies wars since the 1990s. Remember what we saw last week. The last point we saw regarded the then French President Nicolas Sarkozy's decision to modify Article 35 of the French Constitution. The aim of this reform was to permit the French representatives to somehow control the president's decisions to go to war. That is to say, it belonged to the French Parliament to decide if or not French troops sent abroad to fight a war were allowed to fight this war longer than 4 months after the decision had been taken by the president precisely. So it was a kind of French version of the American War Powers Act, which goes back to 1973 to the end of the Vietnam War. But I also emphasize, ladies and gentlemen, the speech or the discourse, or the letter actually, the letter that Sarkozy had sent at that time to the French representatives, a discourse that we can consider as a performative discourse. What is a performative discourse? It is a discourse which all at once describes a phenomenon and which produces a new phenomenon. That is to say, it is a discourse which, in our case here, described what was going on according to Sarkozy in Afghanistan. France was fighting a war against barbarism. The French security was at stake, the French values, the French place in the world. And this description then, somehow, the aim pursued was to produce the result that Nicolas Sarkozy expected, that is to say, the extension of France's military presence in Afghanistan. And it worked because the parliament, the French parliament, indeed permitted this extension. And I came to the conclusion last week that contrary to appearances, the French foreign policy decision-making process was anything but democratic, and I generalized this, of course, to the US and to Western liberal democracies in general, Western liberal powers, that is to say France, the US, and the UK. In today's chapter, then, I will try to show that this supremacy, if not the monopoly of the executive power to conduct foreign policy in general and to decide to launch wars and how these wars should be fought, should be waged, this supremacy, this monopoly is reinforced by mainstream media, which I consider to be our government's little helpers, or to quote the subtitle of today's lecture, weapons of mass communication. The term weapons of mass communication, I took it from a French edited book, which analyzed information, notably in the US, during the two American military operations, 1991 Iraqi Desert Storm and 2003 Iraqi freedom. And I would like to start today's analysis with the empirical illustration of the French newspapers precisely when they commented on Sarkozy's request to the French parliament asking the representatives to permit an extension of France's presence in Afghanistan. I will start with the editorial published on September 22, 2008 by the French newspaper Le Figaro. Have a look at the slide. What do we see? To win in Afghanistan, Western countries have to understand that they are engaged in real conflicts against an implacable enemy. There is no option. There is no option but to prevail and to reduce this main source of international terrorism, and therefore to favor a withdrawal, to call for withdrawal of the French forces is unrealistic. The editorial goes on. The French must first better understand the issue at stake. So the role of the parliament, and to some extent the role of the media too, is to play a kind of educational role to permit the citizens to understand what precisely is at stake in Afghanistan. It is the role of the parliament to convince, I quote, a public opinion somehow naturally reluctant to see French troops engaged somewhere on the other side of the world. So France's duty, the last sentence, is not to pass the buck, not to rely on America to fight this, to wage this fight against terrorism, but to help carry the struggle out. The only criticism, moderate criticism, which is put forward in this editorial regards the way the war is waged. Should we satisfy with the way the war is waged? Certainly not. And a bit later, towards the end of the editorial, it is necessary to fight this war better. This is the first example, the first empirical illustration. The French students know that Le Figaro is a right-wing newspaper, which amounts to saying that at that time, given that the president was a right-wing president, Nicolas Sarkozy, to some extent, Le Figaro was his master's voice. What is therefore all the more so relevant is that the French newspaper of reference, that is Le Monde, almost perfectly published a similar editorial. The editorial was published on September 21, and Le Monde goes as far as appreciating Sarkozy's reform, though throughout the 5 years of Nicolas Sarkozy's presidency, Le Monde criticized the domestic political decisions and somehow the underlying right-wing philosophy or ideology of the president. But when it came to have a look at his foreign policy, no criticism. Thanks to the reform, I quote, of the constitution desired by Nicolas Sarkozy, on Monday, September 22, France will take a step to get closer to other Western democracies. So France will come closer to the American democracy, where the parliament, thanks to the War Powers Act, has a word to say when it comes to go to war. Then Le Monde reminds us why France had decided to intervene in Afghanistan. The decision went back to 2001, after America's Operation Enduring Freedom, when NATO troops, including French, therefore, intervened in Afghanistan to contribute to state building. The situation in Afghanistan is complex. In 2001, in full cohabitation, right-wing President Chirac, left-wing Prime Minister Jospin decided that France should participate in the International Security and Assistance Force. So an appeal or reminder of the national unity, of the kind of sacred union that prevailed at that time, that permitted France to involve itself in Afghanistan. Le Monde also emphasizes that at that time there was a kind of hope that the intervention would be limited in scope, in duration. It emphasized that a guerrilla war started, that the number of casualties increased, that foreign troops, including the Western, including the French ones, and Western troops more general, are somehow perceived by a part of the Afghan population as occupiers. So Le Monde acknowledges the difficulties that Western powers have to stabilize the situation, to build a state, to build a nation or a democracy in Afghanistan. And yet, to the question, should we abandon the Afghans? The response is the following one: certainly not. So we should not leave. We have to, or Le Monde hopes that the French representatives will vote the extension of France's presence. And here again, the only somehow moderate criticism regards the revision of the strategy that should be adopted in order to fight once again a better war. The same analysis is put forward by one specific journalist of Le Monde, Laurent Zecchini. No need to go into the details. It's almost exactly the same argumentation, with also the emphasis put on the educational role in order to convince the French citizens that the war in Afghanistan, or the military operation, is worth being fought, deserves to be supported. So these arguments, then, ladies and gentlemen, if we sum them up, these arguments somehow echo perfectly the then French president's statements. First statement: given the issue at stake, France has to take its fair share in the war against terrorism in Afghanistan. Any criticism against France's presence or involvement in Afghanistan would be synonymous, according to these editorials, would be synonymous with divisions endangering the national unity, which our troops expect and which our troops deserve. We have to support their fight. And in order to make sure that the support will prevail in the future, the French public must be educated. It must be educated by the representatives in the case of the executive power unable to do so. So very strong complementarity between mainstream media and the executive power, as proven by these editorials. What's more is that Western newspapers, mainstream newspapers, admittedly, not merely share the same analysis as the one put forward by the executive power in their editorials. They also share the same description. That is to say, when, rather than commenting on the wars that are fought by Western liberal democracies, when, rather than commenting on these wars, they describe what is going on to some extent on the battlefield. Western mainstream media report the viewpoint of the executive power. And this, ladies and gentlemen, is due to the fact that in the domain of foreign policy in general, and also in the domain of wars, the main source of information precisely is provided by the executive power. That is to say, when it comes to inform the readers or the audience of TV networks, when it comes to inform them of what is going on, not commenting on we should do this or not, etc., we should improve what we are doing, merely when describing what is going on, the mainstream media, our mainstream media, do spread the point of view of the executive power. And this point is acknowledged by the New York Times. The New York Times, as proven by some excerpts of kind of mea culpa, published by the New York Times Ombudsman. The New York Times Ombudsman is the public editor, whose role, he's independent within the New York Times, whose role is to protect journalistic integrity and to make sure that the good practices, good journalistic practices prevail at the New York Times. So on May 30, 2004, that is to say 1 year, a bit more than 1 year after the end of Operation Iraqi Freedom, and actually when the provisional government headed by Paul Bremer was coming to an end because of the election of Iraq, because of the organization of Iraqi elections in Iraq. Daniel Okrent, the Ombudsman, published a critical article commenting on precisely what had gone wrong during the months preceding the war and throughout the operation Iraqi freedom itself. That is to say, he somehow admits that the New York Times had not lived up to the standard of somehow serious journalism. He acknowledges that the coverage of this war, of this Operation Iraqi Freedom by the New York Times had actually consisted in reproducing exactly the same viewpoint as the one of the Bush administration. So let's have a look at some sentences of this self-reflexive article. Early this month, I began to look into a question: why had the Times failed, the New York Times? Why had the New York Times failed to revisit its own coverage of the Iraqi weapons of mass destruction? To anyone who read the paper between September 22 and June 2003, that is to say between September 2, when the George Bush administration somehow indirectly announced its intention to go to war, and June 2003, the end of the military operation, the impression that Saddam Hussein possessed or was acquiring weapons of mass destruction seemed unmistakable. However, it appears to have been mistaken. That is to say, the New York Times spread wrong information. The Times' flawed journalism continued in the weeks after the war began, when journalists could have broken and should have broken free from the cloaked government sources, hidden government sources, told them what to publish. They had insinuated themselves and their agendas into the pre-war coverage, and he emphasized that it was not a question of some specific journalists, though one specifically was more concerned. We'll come back to her. It was not a question of some specific journalists, individual journalists, committing mistakes, if I may use this term, but the failure was institutional. It was not individual, last sentence, but it was institutional. The New York Times, ladies and gentlemen, is supposed to be, and to some extent is, the most trustworthy newspaper in the world. And the fact that it is able to criticize itself somehow proves this image, this self-image, or this image, which is equivalent maybe to the BBC in the domain of TV networks. If the New York Times was able to be self-reflexive, this, of course, was not the case of other American media, whose information was all the more so biased. This was notably the case of Fox News, the American TV network, whose coverage of the crisis preceding the war and of Operation Iraqi Freedom itself, and America's presence after the operation, actually consisted in cheerleading the viewpoint of the George Bush administration. And this is the reason why scholars of media studies coined a new expression, the Fox effect. The Fox effect designated, and still designates nowadays to some extent, a form of collusion, a form of connivance between a government on the one hand and an allied medium. And to do what? Well, to spread live propaganda to public opinion by means of fear. So Fox News, in their information about Saddam Hussein throughout the Iraqi crisis, merely consisted in relaying the Bush administration's vision of the war to come to a public opinion, which amounts to saying that, of course, it did not play its role of a pluralistic press, which is supposed to permit the public to access to a broad range of different alternative viewpoints. And Fox News, in doing so, contributed to shape the public opinion of America in order for this public opinion to support George Bush's decisions. The empirical proof of this Fox effect has been given by opinion polls who studied the evolution of American public opinion roughly from spring 2002 up to spring 2003, as you say, before the operation was conceived of and after the end of Operation Iraqi Freedom. So there is an opinion poll of the Chicago Council on Foreign Relations of June 2002. And in this poll, 65% of the respondents, 65 said that if America decided to go to war against Iraq, it should do so with an authorization, an explicit authorization by a UN, a security resolution. Only 20% agreed with the hypothesis of the US doing it alone, going to war without any explicit UN resolution. And 13% were opposed to any kind of war. So at least 65% were opposed to America acting unilaterally. June 2002. In May 2003, a majority of 68% of American citizens or respondents to a poll said that, I quote, the US made the right decision to go to war in Iraq. So 65 were opposed. 1 year before the war, 68 agreed with the war once Operation Iraqi Freedom had come to an end after 10 weeks or so of the military operation itself. And a detailed analysis of what happened during the Iraqi crisis confirms that this evolution was due to the way American media in general and Fox News more specifically did cover Operation Iraqi Freedom. The more people believed that weapons of mass destruction had been found in Iraq, the more American citizens believed that there had been links found, empirical proofs found of the links between Al-Qaeda and Saddam Hussein, Al-Qaeda guilty of 9/11. And the more American citizens believed that other states, including Arab ones, supported America's operation, the more they had watched Fox News, and the more, of course, they had supported the decision to go to war. They were 2 times more likely to, those who watched Fox News were 2 times more likely to believe that the US had found weapons of mass destruction, that Arab states were supporting America, and that there was a link, a proven link between the terrorist network of Osama bin Laden and the regime of the Iraqi regime of Saddam Hussein. To put it differently, and here is then the justification of the subtitle of today's chapter: American media during the Iraq crisis played the role of weapons of mass communication in the service of the Bush administration, whose analysis they spread without any attempt to check a bit critically those information that were provided by the Bush administration. And this was due to what is considered in the US as objective journalism. What is objective journalism? Objective journalism consists in reporting to the public what the members of the political establishment thinks and says of a political event, a political process. In this case, the crisis and the war, the crisis with Iraq and the war against Iraq. The allusion is in Daniel Arkwright's article, "The Cloaked Government Sources," the hidden, the concealed government sources providing information to the journalists who then publish them for their public. And this objective journalism is considered to be the job that journalists are supposed to do. I would like to quote Judith Miller, one of the journalists of the New York Times, who after the war was criticized of having accepted uncritically the viewpoint of the George Bush administration. This is what she said. My job is not to assess the government's information. My job is not to be an independent analyst myself. My job is to tell readers of the New York Times what the government thought about Iraq's arsenal of prospectively weapons of mass destruction. So the New York Times and also the other newspapers and TV networks spread what the government, the American Bush administration, thought about Iraq's weapons of mass destruction arsenal. Why the government within what we may call the Washington's political establishment? Well, because in the domain of foreign affairs, ladies and gentlemen, and all the more so in wartime, the government, the administration, is considered to be the primary source. Why? Because of thanks to its intelligence of the situation. And given the absence of any somehow credible alternative information provided by other sources. Of course, what Saddam Hussein might have said in 2002 or 2003 was hardly credible for the American public, but also for American journalists. This is somehow understandable. This objectivity then, the objectivity of journalists consists in reporting on those viewpoints of the policy establishment. And in the domain of foreign policy, the government possesses information. And to some extent, no one else possesses somehow credible information. And here then we see the difference between what objectivity means when it comes to cover foreign policy events and when it comes to cover domestic political events. Objectivity in the meaning of impartiality, in the meaning of balanced reports, taking into account different alternative viewpoints, is possible when it comes to public information about domestic political events. Take the example of Black Lives Matter in the US, take the examples of the Yellow Vests, the movement in France 2 or 3 years ago. What do journalists do? They're interested in having point of view of protesters, of policemen, of experts, of sociologists, of local politicians, of national politicians or for political parties, of the Home Department, etc., etc. Because there are likely to be many points of views of people directly or indirectly involved in the events, in this case, Black Lives Matter movement or the Yellow Vest movement. So the variety of sources makes an objective and an impartial, balanced information possible, or at least it makes it conceivable. But in the domain of foreign affairs, and also in the domain of security, in the domain of defense, the spontaneous source that journalists think of is the executive power. And journalists only take into account alternative views when they are expressed by political opponents belonging to the establishment. In the case of Iraqi freedom, we saw this in another chapter. In the case of Iraqi freedom, the American Democratic Party did not criticize Bush. The Democrats in the Senate, in the House of Representatives, contributed to adopt the joint resolution, that is to say, the authorization to use military force as the president determined. They did not criticize the viewpoint of George W. Bush. They were not even interested in trying to know whether his claims were somehow corroborated by empirical facts. And since there was no criticism, there was no alternative voice that the journalists might have been tempted to look for in order to balance a little bit more their reports. So mainstream media, ladies and gentlemen, are weapons of mass communication or weapons of mass distraction, to use the expression of Daniel Arendt, mass distraction. That is to say, they end up distracting people from what people might be interested in listening to if they were told alternative stories. And it is my claim, ladies and gentlemen, I will try to prove it, that mainstream media in the Western liberal democracies are all the more so weapons of mass communication or weapons of mass distraction because of a more and also recent evolution, the return, I would say for some 40 years now, 40 years, yes, of what we can call explicit censorship, both implicit and actually explicit, but also implicit censorship, both political and military censorship. And I will therefore have a look at the history of media power relationship, and I rely on different scientific studies, of course, and first and foremost on the media at war kind of synthesis provided by the British student of media studies, Susan Carruthers. I quote page number 1, where she sums up the ambiguous relationship between the media and the military. War and media have enjoyed a long, intricate relationship, at once supportive and conflicted, replete with recriminations and declarations of independence on the part of both soldiers and reporters, followed by acknowledgement of mutual need. The kinship, the close connection, listen to this, very interesting, between the gun and the camera is pretty often emphasized. What does the camera do and what does the gun do? It brings its subjects into sharp focus before shooting a picture or before shooting a bullet. So you see the very close and ambiguous connection between media and the military, or media at war, when media are at war. And this history of ambiguous relationship goes back to World War I. Basically, World War I, when explicit censorship prevailed in Western liberal democracies, at that time France, the UK, and a bit later the US, where they joined World War I to fight against the autocratic Central European empires of Germany and Austria-Hungary. It is in the context of World War I that the American Senator Hiram Johnson emphasized a phrase that you may know: the first casualty when war comes is truth. Truth is the first casualty. Censorship was prevailing during World War I, and it was somehow admitted as normal by the then media and journalists, with one exception in France, very famous for the French students, Canard Enchaîné, criticizing Madame Anastasie, that is to say, the censorship symbolized in this the picture of this old woman controlling what the journalists did or did not publish. World War One, in American newspapers, since America hesitated before committing itself in the war up to 1917, so during 2 years and a half, America was not involved in the war, and some American media were eager to support Great Britain. So what did they do to try to exert some pressure via their readers upon President Wilson to convince him that America should go to war? The American public was fed with stories of dreadful atrocities committed by the Germans, who were called the Huns, as the Huns that had invaded the Roman Empire in the 5th century. So the German soldiers were nicknamed the Huns, and they were pictured as rampaging across Europe. There were tales of Belgian nurses whose breasts had been sliced off, whose babies had been bayoneted to death. And these stories, pretty often invented, somehow contributed to reorient the public attitudes in order to turn them into being favorable to Wilson joining the war. Similar atrocities, ladies and gentlemen, were invented. I have to use the term invented when America, George Bush father, considered to launch Operation Desert Storm in 1991. After the war, we learned that US news organizations had published a testimony of a young Kuwaiti girl who claimed that she had been witnessing in a hospital in Kuwait when the Iraqi troops arrived on August the 2nd, 1990. She had witnessed, this is what she said, Iraqi troops throwing babies from incubators, killing newborn babies, premature babies. And after the Gulf War, then it came out that this story had been invented. By whom? By the Kuwaiti ambassador in Washington, who had hired the service of an American public relations firm to precisely invent this story to have a greater support in the American public to be favorable to America intervening against Saddam Hussein. What's more, the young girl concerned was the daughter of the Iraqi ambassador. So atrocities were emphasized nowadays and in the past, and also in the past and nowadays we have in many media reports a somehow explicit gender dimension. Soldiers, and more specifically male soldiers, are pretty often portrayed in our media reports as protecting women. This had been the case in the US at the very end of the 19th century, so a bit before World War I, when America intervened militarily against Spain to permit Cuba to become independent. And then a major communication group in the US owned by Randolph William Hearst, he who inspired Orson Welles in his movie Citizen Kane, published also both articles and illustrations about atrocities committed by the Spaniards, the Spanish police and Spanish army in Cuba, notably against women, as you can have an idea here on this picture. So the objective pursued was to convince the American public that America should send its male soldiers to protect innocent Cuban women sexually harassed by the Spaniards. And if at that time male soldiers' role was to protect women, in nowadays Western liberal democracies wars, the role of male soldiers is to set women free from their male masters. For instance, in Afghanistan, one of the arguments put forward when America launched its Operation Enduring Freedom, and also after the operation itself, when the state building operation ended up in maintaining American troops and Western troops more general in Afghanistan, one of the arguments put forward was that the fight against terrorism, against Al-Qaeda, against the Taliban also was fought, I quote, Laura Bush, the spouse, the wife of George Herbert Bush, the fight against terrorism is also a fight for the rights and for the dignity of Afghan women. Only the terrorists and the Taliban, I quote, forbid education for women. Only the terrorists and the Taliban threaten to pull out women's fingernails for wearing a nail polish. So the cover of America's military campaign in Afghanistan consisted in looking for arguments likely to convince the American public opinion that the war concerned, the military operation concerned, was pursuing a noble objective such as setting women free from their Afghan or from their Muslim male masters. Let's come back to the history of the media military relationship. So World War I, explicit censorship, and almost nobody tried to bypass it. The same was true during World War II, but World War II was a noble war in the Western world, of course, given the aggression launched by Nazi Germany. So since World War II was fought for noble reasons, journalists did not perceive censorship because they sympathized, of course, with the aims of the Allied powers in their reports when spreading their information about the war. This then contributes to explain that since the relationships have been very positive between the army and the Western armies and the Western media throughout World War II, this explains that somehow, unawarely, indirectly, the Western media became the spokespersons of the military and political authorities in the US in the next wars that the US fought. In Korea first, 53, and above all, first and foremost, in Vietnam, when America committed itself in the Vietnam War under Kennedy's administration, under Kennedy's administration, up to Johnson and Nixon. And given the good relationships that had prevailed during World War II and also during the Korean War, the journalists, the investigative journalists in Vietnam, well, they benefited from very significant freedom, which permitted them to witness what concretely was going on. And of course, they reported on what we may call the dark side of America's war in Vietnam, which can be summed up in three pictures that were published in American newspapers. A little girl escaping napalm bombing, a Viet Minh or Viet Cong, Viet Minh guerrilla fighter killed mercilessly by a South Vietnamese policeman, and the My Lai massacre, which took place at the end of the 60s. Thanks to these pictures, possible thanks to the formerly positive relationships between the media and the armies, the American public was able to see in its newspapers and on their TV screens what precisely was going on in Vietnam. And these pictures, plus pictures of coffins of American soldiers coming home to the US dead, of course, contributed to reorient the American public's opinion towards the Vietnam War, and more, the majority of the American public opinion, all the more so on American campuses, became hostile to America's intervention, which contributes to explain that there is a kind of, we'll come back to this point in another section of today's chapter, of today's lecture, which contributes to explain that for American, there's a wide-held belief, in, at least among American political and military elites, that the war in Vietnam was lost because of the media coverage, which contributed to change the American public opinion, to turn it into being hostile to the intervention. What is beyond doubt is that the American politicians and the American military authorities drew the conclusion of the coverage that had prevailed during the Vietnam War. That is to say, they reintroduced explicit censorship, and the first one to do so was Margaret Thatcher. When Great Britain launched its defensive war against Argentinians who had invaded the Falklands Island in 1982. Explicit censorship was reintroduced. It was also somehow easy to do so because of the remote location in the southwestern corner of the Atlantic Ocean, 6,000 to 7,000 miles away from Great Britain. It was impossible for English or British reporters to be physically present on the battlefields. So they could only be present under the supervision of the militaries themselves, of the British Army itself. And during this Falklands War, then the pictures and the movies that were shown to the British public were made by the Army's communication department itself, and then given to the media, who spread them to the public. And the journalists' reports, those who had been admitted on the ships navigating from the Channel and the Irish Sea to the Falklands, the journalists' reports had to be approved by the military authorities before being published. So an explicit censorship. Of course, this explicit censorship was criticized by the media once the war was over. The media in Great Britain, Reagan used exactly the same practice when America invaded a very short military expedition, the Caribbean island of Grenada, and also when America toppled Panama's General Noriega in 1989. We thus come to Operation Desert Storm in 1991, February 1991. Given the criticisms raised by Western media, a new news management, if we can use this term, was invented by Western military and political authorities. Concretely, so-called media reporting teams were created. That is to say, only British, American, and French reporters enjoyed the privilege of having access to the battlefields, that is to say, to the Western powers fighting against Saddam Hussein's troops to force him to withdraw from Kuwait. The French, the British, and the Americans, because they were the major partners of the US-led coalition, acting on the basis of the UN resolution, the UN Security Council resolution. So to join these media reporting teams, the French, the British, and the American journalists, what were they required to do? They had to sign a list, a set of guidelines that they had to respect. They had to cede their rights to conduct off the record interviews with military personnel, agreeing to submit a copy of these interviews for security reviews. And they had to consent to remain with and to obey their military escorts at all times. That is to say, no freedom of investigation of Western journalists during Operation Desert Storm. And of course, freelance journalists, as you can imagine, hesitated to join the battlefield because they were obviously risking their life. This then explains that almost no picture of concrete corpses, of dead bodies, neither of Western soldiers, but the number was very small, or of Iraqi soldiers, was published during the war itself. Only one picture of the charred head of the Iraqi soldier in his tank was published by the British newspaper The Observer on March 3. That is to say, 3-4 days after the end of Operation Desert Storm, which lasted from January 18 to February 28. During the operation itself, no such picture was published in Western newspapers. The only pictures that we had the right to see were similar to this one. Kuwait City to Basra, which is a city in Iraq. The highway from Kuwait City to the city of Basra, which was called the Highway of Death. Highway of Death, as you can see the military vehicles that are destroyed, the tanks, etc., but you see no corpse, no dead body. We did not see in 1991 any dead soldier killed by Western armies. Last stage in this evolution of the ambiguous relationship between the media and the military is the so-called stage of embedded journalism. Embedded journalism was invented in 2003 when America once again went to war in its Operation Iraqi Freedom against Saddam Hussein. 600 American journalists and 128 British journalists, the coalition of the willing, to quote the George Bush administration, was notably composed by the British anti-Americans. So 600 American journalists and 128 British journalists were embedded in the British and American army. That is to say, they were allowed to escort the British army, or actually the British and the American army escorted the journalists concerned. And the objective pursued, the intention pursued by this new model of media-military relationship was to bring the perspectives of the soldiers on the one hand and of the journalists on the other hand into alignment. And that is to say, very concretely, when on the battlefield, a military unit came under fire from Iraqi adversary, not merely the soldier's life was at stake, but also the journalist's life was at stake. Which amounts to saying that the journalist felt exactly the same thing as the soldier. Rather than reporting somehow objectively on what was going on, well, the reporter identified with the soldiers, the perception of the soldiers, a perspective. It is impossible not to identify, since you live exactly the same experience as the soldier, and very precisely, you may be killed. So when these reporters then sent their story, their movie, or their article to the media to which they belonged, this is what they wrote: we were fired on. We were fired on. Not unit X or Y of the British Army or of the American Army was fired on. No, we were fired on. So absolutely no possibility of somehow proposing a somehow critical or merely objective report of the situation. It was a subjectively felt report. And ladies and gentlemen, when thinking of the wars that occurred after 2003 in Libya, in Syria and Iraq against ISIS, and regarding France in Mali, in our French newspapers, in our French magazines, in our French TV networks, well, what do we see? We see what the French army permits us to see. So nothing has changed since Operation Iraqi Freedom. Is this situation that different from what Russian citizens see on their official TV networks, on their Russian TV networks, or in their Russian newspapers that are still allowed, and of course controlled? I ask the question, ladies and gentlemen. We see now, to make another allusion to the war in Ukraine, we see the pictures of Ukrainian victims killed by probably and surely Russian bombings, of course. But we see them because we sympathize with them, and therefore they are published by our media after having been taken, both the pictures and the movies, the films, by notably smartphones of individual Ukrainian citizens. So since we sympathize with them, we see them, they are shown to us. But we do not see the pictures of victims of the French intervention in Mali, or the American intervention in the different wars. When I Google Iraqi freedom pictures, what do I see? This is on the slide. You see the Google screenshots, this 15 or 16 first pictures on Google. When you look for Operation Iraqi Freedom pictures, you see no dead corpse, you see no dead body. The same is true for Operation Barkhane. You see only pictures that were taken, I guess, by the army itself, or by embedded journalists whose reports are controlled by the French military. The only disturbing pictures regarding, once again, of America's war in Iraq are those of the Abu Ghraib prison. Probably because the two soldiers concerned, well, are accused of having committed crimes. They did not respect their prisoners, etc. So we do morally criticize them, and they, by definition, to some extent, represent a very small minority of American soldiers. Morally, they are criticized. Morally, they are condemned for their behavior towards Iraqi prisoners, treated as unhuman beings. But there is no political criticism in our media against the war itself. To sum up my argument, ladies and gentlemen, Western mainstream media, since the end of the Cold War, do not play the role of the fourth estate that they are supposed to play according to the liberal theory. The fourth estate, which is supposed to check the executive power or the legislative power. That is to say, they do not, our Western media, our Western mainstream media, I have to confess that since I'm not a war media student, of course, I do not know whether social media and smartphones, technology, etc., did introduce a change, but I would spontaneously say no, but I cannot prove this. So I go on sticking to more classical media, and I apologize for this limit, of course. Our Western mainstream media, ladies and gentlemen, they do not live up to the objective that they are supposed to pursue, to the mission or to the function that they are supposed to accomplish. That is to say, to empower individual citizens by keeping them informed, by stimulating their critical mind, thanks to different viewpoints that they publish. These different viewpoints, which are supposed to trigger pluralist debates, out of which then a kind of rational decision reflecting the different point of views is likely to be taken by our politicians who are supposed to be accountable to Western citizens. To sum up this idea, our Western mainstream media do not live up to what they should do in what Habermas called the public sphere. This is the German original essay of Jürgen Habermas, where he coined the expression of the public sphere. According to Habermas, the public sphere emerged during the Enlightenment century, notably in England and in France, when the press, which we now know, was born, when also saloons, cafes, and reading societies emerged against the absolutist monarchy, notably in France. This press, then, ladies and gentlemen, according to Habermas's analysis, it was his PhD dissertation, this is his first major essay. The press at that time, what did it do? Why did it emerge? Well, it was produced by the bourgeois, a merchant class, which was opposed to the aristocrats who were monopolizing the political authority via the king, the monarch, the absolutist monarch. So this press, the first press, published, and to publish means to make accessible, to make available to the public opinion. So the press, created and owned by a private merchants, bourgeois merchants, published those decisions that the political authority took in the domain of fiscal policies, in the domain of police, in the domain of fixing the prices of the goods that average people could buy. So to publish the decisions of the political authority in order for these decisions to no longer remain private to some extent. And after this first step, what did the press do? Well, not merely did it publish these information, but it started commenting on them. And potentially it started criticizing them if it did not agree with the underlying objectives pursued by the political authorities. So they gradually transformed the press, at that time, gradually transformed itself into a kind of intermediary between the public political authority, which actually acted on a private basis, secret. And it is thanks to the media that the decisions became public. So the press played the role of an intermediary between the authority, the political authority on the one hand, and citizens on the other hand, so the citizens could know what was going on and could themselves think of what to do if they disagreed, or what to counter-propose as alternative measures if they disagreed with the policy concerned. And thus emerged the public space, or the public sphere, synonymous with an indirect participation of the people, of average people, to the political decision-making process. These different opinions put forward by the media and reinforced, amplified by the readers when they read the information concerned, permitted public deliberations, public debate, which then indirectly contributed to influence the decisions that were taken later by the political authorities. So this is the role that newspapers, the media more generally, in the Western liberal democracies are supposed to play according to the liberal theory, the liberal philosophy. The problem, however, is that, as we saw up to now in today's lecture, this is not the case. The majority of mainstream media play the role of cheerleaders of our governments in the domain we are interested in the domain of the wars fought since the end of the Cold War. How can we explain this absence of any kind of critical mind? The main reason put forward by Susan Carruthers in her book consists in saying that most media, I quote, are commercial enterprises. They are commercial enterprises, so they need to be financed by private actors, private firms, private organizations, And therefore, to some extent, since they have to satisfy advertisers and also potential advertisers, well, they cannot afford to be too critical. And in wartime, where national unity prevails, they cannot but inform their readers or their audience with the same information which contributes to the national unity, in order not to be considered somehow as traitors to this kind of sacred union. Another explanation, ladies and gentlemen, is put forward by left-wing critical scholars, Marxist-inspired media students who in France were, because it belongs to the past, represented by the philosopher Louis Althusser, and in America, up to very recently, by Noam Chomsky, notably in his book Manufacturing Consent. Their approach, Marxist-inspired, is kind of updated version of interwar Marxist critiques, such as the Frankfurt School, which coined the expression of a culture industry and mass deception, mass consumption and mass deception on the one hand, and the Italian philosopher Antonio Gramsci, who coined the expression of a cultural hegemony and of organic intellectuals. Organic intellectuals are intellectuals who spread the official point of view, who reproduce the official point of view of the dominant class. So Louis Althusser, more specifically in the 1960s, so during the Vietnam War, and after France's Algerian War, coined the expression of ideological state apparatuses. According to Althusser, the media, but also the army and the school, education, are ideological state apparatuses whose role is to reproduce what Marxists consider to be the alienation of the masses, of the proletarians. And in doing so, by spreading the official truth, they reproduce the existing order, which favors, of course, the dominating bourgeois class and their representatives, that is to say, the central governments. And the same idea, more or less, is put forward by Noam Chomsky in his Manufacturing Consent, the political economy of the mass media, where he claims that since World War I, political elites, supported by business circles, so there's a coalition, a political economic coalition, have systematically orchestrated, thanks to the media, the mass media precisely, propaganda, in order to make sure that average citizens, such as you and me, do accept the existing order. So I am not a media studies specialist, and I somehow consider these hypotheses of left-wing Marxist-inspired theorists to be excessive, to be too radical. I do not think there is a kind of unitary dominant class, or less so using consciously mass media to manipulate the citizens. I do not think so. What I do think, what I do share as an analysis is the idea that there's a kind of shared perception of, in our domain, the wars that are fought, which explains why the journalists on one hand and the political authorities on the other hand, and first and foremost the executive power, are do share the same analysis and do put forward the same analysis. That is to say, they are mutually interdependent, and the interdependence is a bit unequal, because the media are more dependent on the politicians than the politicians are dependent on the media. And the empirical evidence of this hypothesis is given by Daniel Hallin in his analysis of the Vietnam War, which he called the uncensored war, but you see that it is between hyphens in quotation marks, since things were more complicated. So let's have a look at this book. The main claim put forward, as I already mentioned at the beginning of today's class, there is a kind of belief, a wide-held belief in the US that the war was lost because of the American public opinion criticizing the war, ending up becoming hostile to the war. And this was because of the war, because of the American public seeing on their TV networks American soldiers being killed and American soldiers using chemical weapons and committing the exactions that they committed against their communist adversaries, while America's security was not at stake. To put it differently, according to the American establishment, America lost the war not because it was military inefficient or because the Vietnamese were more efficient, but because of the domestic front, which refused to support the American troops. Hallin shows that this wide-held belief actually is wrong. It is wrong because he shows in his analysis that during the first years of the war, the very significant majority of American citizens were favorable to the war. And when they changed their opinion, it was not necessarily because of the pictures that we saw that were shown in the American media, but it was because within the foreign policy establishment of the US, some politicians, members of the Democratic Party, since, of course, Nixon was a Republican president, some members of the Democrats started criticizing the war, at least asking whether America's national security, etc., was at stake in the war. That is to say, given the so-called objective journalism of American reporters, they no more are satisfied with reporting the Nixon administration's point of view, but they also reported, in order to establish a kind of balance, they also reported the critiques or the questions asked by some critical voices of the American foreign policy establishment, that is to say, those who belong to the Democrats. And then, logically, given these first criticisms, some investigative journalists went to Vietnam in order to find corroborations, empirical illustrations of these criticisms. And, well, they saw what they saw. And therefore, they published the pictures that I showed you. And then the American public opinion started becoming more and more hostile to the intervention. To put it differently, ladies and gentlemen, media indeed reflect what is going on in the political debate within the political elites when it comes to reporting on wars fought by Western liberal democracies. And Daniel Hallin proposed a kind of typology to explain the possibility, the chance or not, of critical voices to be reported in American mainstream media. He distinguished what he called the three ideological spheres, or three ideological provinces. The sphere of consensus, which is the domain of a kind of implicit agreement shared by all the members of the establishment. And then journalists, what do they do? Well, they present this sphere of consensus as the official line. They present this official line, as the only correct point of view. It is the consensus. So there is no critical voice. Then there is the second sphere, which he calls the sphere of legitimate controversy. The sphere of legitimate controversy is a sphere where some issues can be debated by different critical points of views, but within a plurality of compatible analysis, no radical criticism. And then the third sphere, he calls it the sphere of deviance. And the sphere of deviance, this designates those radically critical voices, which precisely because they are too radical, are considered to be too dangerous to be given a fair hearing. So these critical voices are somehow automatically, spontaneously excluded from the articles, from the reports, and also from the editorials of American mainstream media. So when consensus is prevailing, then critical voices are not published. They are marginalized and somehow excluded. When dissensus appears, when dissenting voices among politicians appear, then moderate criticisms no longer are neglected. They are spread in the information because of precisely the journalist's ethic to be objective, as you say, to take into account the official point of view and the somehow a critical analysis in order to propose an objective, a neutral, a balanced information. So during the Cold War, ladies and gentlemen, consensual anti-communism was prevailing. And as long as this was the case, up to the end of the 60s, atrocities committed by American soldiers, notably in Vietnam, but to some extent already in Korea, well, they had no attention. They received no attention by American media. Once some US politicians, in the case of the Vietnam War, wondered whether this war deserved to be fought or not, the journalists' reporting changed. It evolved, and so did editorials, thus contributing to an evolution of the American public opinion, which then indirectly exerted the pressure upon the executive power, Nixon, in our case, study. Since the end of the Cold War, as regards the wars of the Western liberal democracies fought since the end of the Cold War, first, a kind of consensual humanitarianism. We intervene for humanitarian reasons, and therefore we call them humanitarian interventions. First, humanitarianism was consensual during the 90s, and then it was supplemented by a consensual anti-terrorism perception, anti-terrorist perception, of course. These two consensuses did prevent any significant criticism against the Western liberal democracies war, prevented any somehow significant criticisms against the so-called, we saw this now, Chapter 7, collateral damage of our targeted killings undertaken by drone warfare and by our professional armies. To conclude then, ladies and gentlemen, Western media, indeed, since the end of the Cold War, are closer to cheerleaders supporting our executive authorities than to critical voices promoting public debate likely to empower citizens. Investigative journalists report consensual convictions since they have an exclusive access to one primary source, the executive power itself. And editorialists, well, share with these politicians the same underlying ideology or belief or conviction or zeitgeist, to use the expression, the German expression. They share the same zeitgeist, ladies and gentlemen, all the more so they are trained in the same elite schools, in the same Sciences Po, in France notably. or the same elite Ivy League universities in the US. There's therefore kind of a shared mainstream ideology, humanitarianism, and I feel free to go into the details of this dimension of our Western liberal democracies wars in our chapter 10. That is to say, next week. Thank you very much for attending to this class. Hope to see you again next week, and have a great day. Goodbye.